Hey guys, good morning. I wanted to follow up on part 2 of our series we started last week. So if you look back or you haven't watched last week, it's sort of important that you look back last week and read, or listen to, not read, listen to what we talked about. Last week we talked a little bit about, well, we kind of started a series on the newness of life and where we get life from, and why this, especially the month of April, is so critically important for the Christian faith, and really who Jesus is in the midst of Easter. And so last week we talked just about that. Like, we looked directly at Philippians 2 and the humility of who Christ is, and we didn't necessarily look about what he did or all of the semantics surrounding him, but really just took a look and a glimpse into who he was and the model he sets for us as believers. And so this week, I guess our next iteration is like, hey, if Easter's a real thing, right? If Christ really did live on earth as a God and as a man, fully 100% in both, both 100% at all the time, and then he died a death, actually died, heart stopped beating, breath stopped coming out of his mouth, right, died, and then rose from the dead, death couldn't hold him. If those things really did happen, like, the question I think that you have to ask before you get into whether any of that ever happened is like, why? Why would that even be the basis of the gospel for the Christian religion? Like, why would Christians even need that? Like, why would Christianity even push this gospel? Why do we need Jesus? And so I'm going to try and be really succinct here, because I think the answer is unfortunately painfully obvious if you're honest with what you see in culture. But I want y'all to look at Romans 5. I'm going to read just a couple sections from Romans 5, really verses 6 through 7, and then we'll skip down to verse 10, and then I'll make some references throughout. But let me read this to you real quick. Verse 6. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one will dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And you skip down to verse 10, he says, for if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. And if you read Romans 3, like all of Romans 3 is this sort of plea by Paul to the Christians at Rome to see that, hey, that you are broken and sinful at the very core of who you are, that from the very fiber of your being, from the time of conception, you're a sinful person, dead in your trespasses. Romans 3:23, we all fall short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23, that the penalty of sin is death, right? So why do we need Jesus? Well, because without it, like, our sin, our rebellion against God condemns us to death. And not just death physically, death eternally. And so this is sort of the hard week, right? Like, nobody wants to talk about the hard stuff. The easy, loving stuff is that God sent his grace and he loves us and he saves us, and that we are pulled out of our sin. Like, those are all the good, loving things, and those are great things and things to focus on. But the reality is, like, why do doctors, why are they considered successful? Well, because they heal the sick. The first thing they have to do is determine if they're sick. And I think for us, as whether you're a believer or not watching this, it's not easy to see that it's not hard to see that we're sick, right? Like I have right now, currently, have a 3-year-old and a 1-week-old, right? It is easy. There are things that my 3-year-old is doing that I didn't teach her those things. She didn't pick that up from the culture she's been around. There's some iterations that have rolled out of her in the last week. I may or may not have called her a terrorist. I mean, she has brought a new type of challenge to our home that we didn't teach her, right? I promise you this, my 3-year-old has never seen me bite anybody, right? She didn't learn that from dad, right? My 3-year-old has never seen dad take a glass of water and throw it across the room when it's full. She's never seen that, right? She didn't learn that from mom or dad. That is built into who she is. There's a messiness and a rebellion built into who we are as humans. Romans 3 says that no one does good, no one, not even one, right? Romans 5 here that we just read says, for while we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for who? The ungodly. That's an all-encompassing term. He didn't say like he only died for the ungodly. The godly people, he didn't have to die. That's an all-encompassing term. Ungodly is to assume that he's talking to everybody. All people are ungodly. Or the reason I read verse 10 is for while we were enemies of God, right? He didn't just die for his friends, right? This one says that one makes sense. Like, the fact is he died for his enemies, those who are pitted in rebellion against him. And the truth of that is that's us, right? Like, why would Christ come? Because the whole world, according to Romans 3 and Romans 5 and Psalm 53, and I mean, we could go on and on and on, Ephesians 1, right? Ephesians 2, that we as a race, as humanity, are pitted against God. We're enemies of God. And that goes back to Genesis 3, where God really gives them one thing: don't do this, don't eat from this tree. And what is Eve and Adam? What do? Like, they immediately eat from the tree, right? And that original sin, that first sin, has a corrupting force that has continued through all of mankind, right? If you read all of Romans, Paul goes into this exchange where he says, like, because of one man's sin, all have died, but because of one man's life, Christ, all have lived. He talking about the how Christ came in and fixed what Adam had broken. But the reality is, and the answer to the question I want y'all to hear today, and like I said, I'd try and be short here, is like, why does Christ need to come? Why did we need Christ to actually live, walk on this earth, actually die death, and then rise from the dead? Well, the reality is that we have sinned against God, and one sin, just one, and nobody on this earth can say they've sinned just once, right? One sin is enough to put us in eternal punishment, eternal odds with God, right? In the same way that judges condemn guilty parties in court, God condemns us for our guilt in sinning against him. We are enemies. We're weak, right? We are the ungodly. And yet, God sees us in our rebellion, in our ungodliness, in our weakness as enemies of him. And his reaction isn't to justly and rightly. He would have been just and right to say they're going to get the just penalty for their sin, and that's death. Instead, out of his love, I think that's the important thing that we often miss, that God shows his love for us, that while we were still sinners, he didn't show love for us because we cleaned our life up, right? He didn't show love for us because we started to get it together. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He sent his son. Why did he send his son? Because we were unable to attain relationship with God any other way. Romans 8 says that in the flesh we cannot please God, that nothing in who we are would desire, choose, or believe in God, that God had to work on behalf of man to reach down by his mercy, is what it says, right? By the mercies of God, right? Reach down and save us. And he did it through his son, right? He did it by sending his son to die the death that we deserve. So my sin, my rebellion, my enemy, right? My works of being an enemy against God has created this debt that had to be paid, right? A good, just judge has to pay for that debt. Somebody has to die, right? It's the whole message of the Old Testament, the sacrificial system. My sin deserves death, right? And so God would be an unjust judge just to say, it's fine, let them off, they're good, right? He'd be an unjust judge. We'd be mad at any judge who lets people off just because he feels bad about it, right? And yet God is not that way. He's a just judge. He's a good, righteous, just judge. And so he does have, I think the penalty for our sin is death, and somebody does die, and that person is Jesus Christ, right? Right? He serves as the Bible calls the substitutionary atonement. He is the substitute for our sin, steps in our place. 2 Corinthians 5:21, right? Says that he took on our sin and we gained his righteousness. Even though he was perfect, he took our sin. And so why did Christ have to come? Well, that answer is really simple, is we were helpless without him. We were doomed without him. We were going to be given to the exact desires and hopes that we wanted, and that is death. We desire sin. We desire separation from God. And Christ steps in to save us from our own broken desires. And God, by his mercy, sent his son to save us from that. So last week we looked at who he was. This week, man, I think it's critically important to understand why we even need him. And the reality is we're sick. Why do I need medicine to heal me from the flu? Well, because I have the flu. Why do I need Jesus to heal me? Well, because I'm sick, I'm broken, I'm sinful. And the first step to really seeing the weight and the glory and the beauty of Jesus is to see our own brokenness and be reminded of that often. So I know that's not the most encouraging week. The encouraging piece is we didn't stay there, right? Christ didn't leave us in our sin. God didn't look down on us and take his hands away. He sent his son, and he sent his son to die, not just to wave his magic wand and heal us, but to die for us. That's just a massive, massive exhibition of God's love for us, that you should be encouraged today that God loves us that much, that he would send his son to die for us. All right, guys, talk to you next week.